That's our schedule. Thanks for watching C-SPAN.
Get involved. Be part of a media event. Tune in to the National Press Club on C-SPAN. Politicians, heads of state, public figures, the world's newsmakers address the Washington Press Corps every week, and you've got a front row seat. Saturdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific, only on C-SPAN.
Up next, it's a panel discussion entitled The Harassment of African American Elected and Appointed Officials, sponsored by the 20th Annual Legislative Conference of the Congressional Black Caucus. You will hear from a number of witnesses, including Loretta Williams, co-president of the National Interreligious Commission on Civil Rights, Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, Mary Sawyer, author of The Harassment of Black Elected Officials, 10 Years Later, and the Reverend Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam.
I'd like to welcome each of you to the section on harassment of African American elected and appointed officials. We're so glad you could be with us today, and I'd like to bring up now Dr. Mary Ann Ballinger from Atlanta, Georgia, who will open this the way that we open all such movements. Dr. Ballinger, Reverend. Is it on?
Let us pray. God of grace and God of glory, on your people pour your power. In this hour of trial and tribulation, draw us close to you in all those ways. Only a solid and firm commitment to your ways and your will assure us of success. We realize and recognize ourselves as imperfect beings and seek your perfection. We seek your blessing on all that goes forth this day, your hand of mercy, our continuing growth and faith, and ask all things in the name of Jesus. Let us all say amen.
Thank you, Reverend Ballinger. We'd like to get right into the program this morning, and I have the wonderful task of presenting to you the man who almost became governor of California, and most of his supporters call him that still, but he served as lieutenant governor of the state of California after having served in the Assembly and in the Senate. He left and came here to Washington as the congressman from the 31st Congressional District. He is the one man who consistently, for at least the last 15 years, has told us about the pervasiveness of harassment and intimidation of black elected officials and black leaders. If only we had listened to him 15 years ago. I bring to you this morning my boss, the Honorable Mervyn M. Dimely.
Thank you very much, Attorney Faye Williams. Before I address you for a few minutes, let me just make one important announcement. The Congressional Black Caucus believes that nothing is as important as the possibility of the enforcement of the Graham-Rudman Act, which will have a devastating effect on jobs of African Americans across the country. And therefore, they have called an emergency press conference promptly at 11:30 in front of the Capitol steps. We are asking you to bring to an end your deliberations here by 11 and take a cab to the Capitol steps for the press conference. We want you to be participants in the press conference. And after that, then you will come back. I believe there's a lunch here, and then you begin the final phase of this session. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to open these proceedings by telling you how very pleased I am that we are gathered here today. This hearing and your participation is historic. It is historic because it is the product of a consensus in the African community that has been building for the last 15 years. It is not just elected officials who sit here today, firm in the conviction that African American elected officials and appointed officials have been and are being duly unharassed. Today, those elected officials who have long had their own personal experiences to help them distinguish their pattern of prejudicial treatment are not alone. They are joined by church officials and church members, by members of civil rights organizations, and by African American citizens from across the country who now also see a pattern. I say this consensus has taken 15 years to reach because it was 15 years ago that former Lieutenant Governor George Brown of Colorado and I met at a conference of human rights workers and had the opportunity to compare our experiences. As we talked, we realized that our experiences had been shockingly similar. Had he been California's Lieutenant Governor and I Colorado's Lieutenant Governor, what we were telling each other would have changed very little. During that exchange, we realized we had each been looking at small parts of a pattern neither of us recognized until we put together our two pieces and found that they matched very squarely. Our meeting and our comparing of notes happened by chance. There was a second element of chance at play at that conference. It was attended also by a very special person, a person for whom I have been involved with and have had the deepest admiration and respect. And that person is my dear friend, Dr. Mary Sawyer. After hearing our stories, she also felt that our experiences had been too similar to be just chance events. She brought the issue of possible systemic harassment of black elected officials to the attention of the National Association of Human Rights Workers. But she also did much more. Dr. Sawyer is one of that select group of individuals whose personal integrity demands that they find the truth regardless of any personal price that might exist. Dr. Sawyer was not content simply to have her fellow civil rights workers acknowledge that the matter was worthy of further investigation. In an unusual act of sacrifice and volunteerism, she gave up her job in Berkeley as special assistant to the mayor and moved to Sacramento to discover just how widespread the pattern of harassment might be. You must understand that Mary gave up a well-paying job and a solid career to take an unpaid position with no idea of what the outcome that selfless act might bring. She fed herself and sometimes kept a roof over her head by doing part-time consulting work for the California Commission on Economic Development, which I chaired at the time. But she pursued her main work by using the dollars she could muster from church groups and foundations to buy Greyhound bus tickets. In essence, she lived on those buses. They carried her to every corner of this country to talk to African American elected officials about their experiences in office. For 2 years, she pieced the pattern together, and when she finished her investigation, she wrote her report for the National Association of Human Rights Workers. It was the first detailed account ever written of the systematic harassment of black elected officials in the United States. In the ensuing years, the report has become a much sought-after basic reference, and Dr. Sawyer has become the recognized authority on the matter of harassment of black elected officials. The report continued to be in demand long after it went out of print. So 4 years ago, again, Dr. Sawyer agreed to interview currently elected officials and to update the report. We published that update under the title 10 Years Later, and reprinted the original report entitled The Dilemma of Black Politics. The fresh set of interviews led Dr. Sawyer and those who participated with her in the update to the conclusion that nothing had changed in the 10 years since the original report. Although the report and its update have been important in court cases and in educated and civil rights lawyers, I want you to know that until very recently, African Americans as a community did not take the implications of the report very seriously. Armed with the update report, Dr. Sawyer and I traveled around the country several years ago, asking political and civil rights groups to look at their local situations to determine whether there was evidence of a pattern of harassment. I must tell you, that was a disappointing crusade. I found myself wondering over and over again why the African American community seemed so unconcerned about the harassment of elected officials. Somewhere in the course of those journeys, I came to understand that the experience of the African American community is very much like the seemingly independent experiences of George, Brown, and myself. The experience of harassment is a very personal, a very individual experience. It is not shared with others naturally. In other words, when I am harassed, members of my profession and members of my race do not experience the emotions of that harassment. And I do not experience the emotion of others when they are harassed. It is only when we relate our personal experiences and pain to someone else, and in that process find our experience has been far from unique, that we begin to see the pattern. The bottom line is this: harassment is a very personal phenomenon. I think that the very gradual process of linking one experience with another to build towards the consensus has produced two very significant breakthroughs within the year. The first development was that my very good friend Clarence Mitchell III was able to interest the National Council of Churches of Christ, USA, to sponsor a seminar in New York on the topic of harassment. That seminar began to build an important common understanding among African Americans. The second development was that Dr. Benjamin Hooks, Executive Director of the NAACP, raised this sensitive issue with President Bush and subsequently at the annual convention of the NAACP. As you are well aware, Dr. Hooks was criticized for bringing the issue before the President and before the nation. Most importantly, he was criticized by members of the news media in this country, including black members of the media. We like to think that it is the role of those who bring us the news to examine the facts and to report the truth. Instead, in far too many instances, our news people have not reported the facts or truth about their own prejudgments. It is clear there are those in the media who hold the report of smoke to be a confirmation of fire. For them, raising the possibility of harassment is an ipso facto indication that the possible victim of harassment is probably guilty of some wrongdoing. That view is conveyed almost shamelessly by the metropolitan media, and it has been taken up by some black journalists and even, I am sorry to say, a few black politicians and civil rights advocates. It is the view that is carried into our homes and the nightly news by law enforcement officials, all too eager to build a public case for conviction before the trial has occurred. In recent years, it has become a view pressed on the public by certain political groups, two of which in particular have devoted their efforts to targeting selected black officials for an ongoing system of harassment. The foregone conclusion of these people notwithstanding, there's a growing perception among African Americans that black and elected public officials in America are being singled out for harassment. It is a perception that must not be dismissed out of hand. Rather, it is a perception that demands the most serious attention because it calls into question the ability of African Americans to participate fully in the process of American self-government. It is not an issue of the rights and privileges of a few politicians. It is an issue of the civil rights of African Americans. At issue is whether African Americans can indeed be represented by officials who are free to carry out their duties without intimidation, or whether the rights of African Americans, your rights, are being abridged by the intimidation of those you have chosen to represent you. This is an issue that is far too important to be dealt with only in seminars and isolated courtrooms. It is my hope that out of the meeting here today will come a resolution to devote to this issue the resources it deserves. It is my hope, by the close of the meeting today, those of us who represent African American institutions or churches or research groups or organized political associations will agree to do what is necessary to create a formal institution charged with seeing the right of African Americans will be represented before governmental bodies of our land and will no longer be abridged by systematic harassment of officials. Calling this ongoing body a Center for the Study of Harassment, call it the Institute for the Study of Law, Politics, and the Media, call it whatever is appropriate. But deal effectively with this issue, because your rights to be represented is being jeopardized. On behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Council of Churches in Christ, the National Interreligious Commission on Civil Rights, the Clarence Mitchell Jr. Memorial Fund, and myself, I extend to you the warmest welcome to this hearing. May your deliberations be fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimely. Speaking of harassment and intimidation, for a moment there, if those had not been African drums, I would have thought that there had been a conspiracy to harass us. Before we go on, I'd like to recognize the members of our co-sponsors, the National Council of the Churches of Christ. Would those of you who are here please stand? The National Interreligious Commission on Civil Rights, the Clarence M. Mitchell Jr. Memorial Fund, and the Racial Justice Working Group of the National Council. Thank you so very much. Let's give them a big hand. They've been working very diligently on this issue. I'd like now to bring up the people from our co-sponsors or the representatives who will be speaking to you for a few moments and bringing greetings to tell you why we are here. We'd like, first of all, to bring up Dr. Kenyon Burke, the Associate General Secretary, the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA. Following him will be Dr. Loretta Williams, Co-President, the National Interreligious Commission on Civil Rights, and if the senator's here, he would come next.
Good morning. Oh, that sounds good. My assignment here this morning is to respond to the question, why are we here? Our presence here is based upon our simple understanding of God's requirement to do justice. The words of the prophet Micah speak to us clearly on this issue. Micah says, and hear the words of the Lord, God has told us what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Men and women throughout the ages have sought clarity on the requirement of God to do justice. One only has to casually glance at biblical references to see that it has become quite clear the requirement to do justice is in the Bible and the important theme of the Old Testament. And the requirement to love one's brother and sister is one of the most consistent strains in the New Testament. The National Council of Churches has a very strong position on racial justice, and its racial policy statement has a section in it which I would like to quote from. It speaks to the mission of the church. It says, the church is called to identify racism as a sin against God, and it summons the church to eliminate it. Now, in November of 1989, the governing board of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA adopted a resolution based upon some of the reports we were receiving from around the country. Now, I hasten to tell you that the National Council of Churches is a body of 32 communions or denominations of the from the Protestant and Orthodox community, representing 41 million Christians. The National Council of Churches, and permit me to read just excerpts of this resolution to set the stage. The National Council of Churches is witness to the increasing and disproportionate attacks on African American elected officials and other persons and organizations of conscience by law enforcement agencies across the country. Federal law enforcement agencies are engaging in specious sting operations that target black elected officials. The issue is not the possible innocence or guilt of many of the elected officials who have come under attack. The issue is the fact that this pattern of attack by agencies of government in and of itself constitutes criminal activity on the part of government because it subverts and undermines democratic process itself. These politically motivated criminal and civil investigations in effect deny citizens who vote for African American elected officials their full constitutional rights under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Therefore, be it resolved that the National Council of Churches calls for a congressional hearing to investigate the unwarranted and unjustified criminal investigations of African American elected officials. It urges its member communions to support this call, and it urges the support of those African American elected officials who come under such attack in their local communities and states. Why are we here? We are here because God's requirement to do justice is on our agenda. That's why we are here.
I bring greetings of welcome to all who are gathered here. For in fact, the interfaith community is saying that we have been slow, we have been remiss in coming to this point of calling for the organizing around this issue, this pattern, the new stumbling blocks, the media slanders, the misuse of prosecutorial powers, the sting operations, the attempted ways to drain away our trust, our financing of those whom we would elect, those whom we would choose, those who have made their ways up and begin to see how systems of power operate in this country, this so-called democracy. So we are pleased to participate, to be part of this expanding public awareness of a pattern that is old, but that is new at the same time. The obstacles continuing to be put in the pathway of African American leadership. The National Interreligious Commission on Civil Rights believes it imperative that a full congressional investigation be conducted, examining and publicly examining this pattern, the policies, the practices that were mentioned by Congressman Dimely. So as the 1990s begin, as we think again about civil rights and where we were and how indeed we prayed, we marched with our feet, 2 and 3 decades ago, we must ask ourselves, where are we now and why are we not at this point saying very clearly that we are opposed to the criminal activity of our government? That is our duty and our task this morning, to look and see, is the criminal activity on the part of the federal institutions, the federal agencies, what is going on here which is subverting and undermining the so-called democracy that we hold very, very high as an American nation? We must organize, we must mobilize, we must support the center, its development, the research, continue what Dr. Sawyer has been doing, but we ourselves have to put our bodies, our feet, our minds, our institutions, and get the resolutions from our institutions, our churches, our sororities, every organization, and get a wave going across the country. As a national and as a regional interfaith organization, we will continue to hold hearings, as we have in New York, as we have in Detroit, as we are doing here, to say we must work together collaboratively to end this pattern, this draining away from our public servants who have worked so very hard with our help to bring us thus far. We must name the issue of power, power imbalance, control, the fact that we will not allow this to continue. We will demand justice. We will work together. Welcome.
I believe I saw Senator Clarence Mitchell come in. He is here. You know him as the son of our esteemed and beloved leader, Clarence Mitchell, Jr. And now I bring you Clarence Mitchell III.
To all of the distinguished members on the dais and the warrior from decades, our great Dr. Dorothy Height, who has carried on the work of freedom, the great organization that Mary McLeod Bethune started. And I can't ever get out of my mind, whenever I get a little bit tired, I can't ever get out of my mind the times that I see Dorothy Height trudging through the airports of this nation with her suitcase in her hand, carrying her suitcase with her, and walking the long length, and especially of the Atlanta airport. And when I came up behind and offered to grab her suitcase from her, she said, "Oh no, I can carry my suitcase." And the freedom that her very being represents must cause us never to be tired. I want to thank the National Council of Churches and all of you who represent organizations and who just represent yourselves for being willing to join together to prevent a repeat of post-Reconstruction in this country. It has already started. It started with Adam Clayton Powell. It started with Charles Diggs. It started with the former Lieutenant Governor George Brown and former Lieutenant Governor Merv Dimley, who was here before, who were on their way to becoming governors of their states and were suddenly cut down by smears, by a conspiracy. And who were the conspirators in that case and who continued to be the conspirators? The United States Department of Justice and some segments of our media. The conspiracy is a criminal conspiracy. It's criminal because prosecutors who are sworn to uphold the law take stolen information from federal grand jury deliberations and take those stolen goods to media representatives who receive stolen goods and go on to print those stolen goods. Joe Delpit down in Louisiana, on the way up, becoming Speaker pro tem, suddenly indicted. Specious charges. Theo Mitchell, now the candidate, the Democratic nominee for governor in South Carolina, was indicted for food stamp fraud some time ago, and of course they're using, mentioning it now in ways that will hopefully effectively destroy his campaign to become the second black elected governor in this country. A little Pat Davis down in Birmingham, Alabama, who gets elected, becomes the first black woman chair of a major committee, and suddenly finds herself facing 6 years on specious charges and no parole, while in Oliver North in this country steals millions, converts contraband, allows drugs to be brought into this country, moves around this country getting $35,000 a speech on probation. And a Lynn Knopfsinger, who says, yes, I committed the crime. I did it, but I didn't know I was committing a crime. Who's found guilty by a jury of his peers, and a 3-judge federal appeals panel made up of 2 Reagan appointees while he was in the White House says, you're right. You didn't know you were committing a crime, And so we reverse your convictions. And he screams victory. The system has worked. We're here because the system has been working for our enemies and against us. And we must challenge in the way that we have as a people over the history of our nation what's going on. Hank Sanders down in Selma, Alabama, who has a district that runs almost as long as the length of the East Coast, who has to travel that district on limited resources, suddenly finds himself under attack where they're trying to disbar him, simply because there's a Tom Bigby River project that's going through his district. Billions in economic development. And so they don't want Hank Sanders and all his newly elected black leaders to have any say or any access to the billions in economic development that are coming through his district. All over the country, I say our great Andy Jenkins, state senator, they found him guilty under a 1930 statute that was passed saying that you had to have a bank in order to accept deposits. He beat them twice and they turned back around and indicted him again. I say to you, the challenge is for us. There's not enough time to give you the litany of hundreds of our black officials who are being chased out of office. And I say to you, we ain't going to take it. And I say to you, the masses of the people out there are ready. The time has come for us to put together a movement and a march like we did in the 60s, where we turn our people out and they are ready to begin to restore the respect that must be given to us, the respect that causes even foreigners to say, black people moving into white neighborhoods is like having a prostitute in your neighborhood, the minister of justice in Japan. I close by reminding you of that little rhyme that we've all heard. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indians. It goes on. Talk about 10 little Indians. And then it goes on to talk about how they disappeared. One hanged himself, one ate himself to death, another, but they finally get down to the fact that there are none. Suddenly there were no little Indians left. Originally, before this rhyme came to this country, it was not 10 little Indians, it was 10 little niggers. And they had committed different kinds of crimes, and they walked charged with them, and they ended up with none. Let us not lose the gains we've made. Let us be prepared to do whatever we have to do to save our people, to save our leadership, and to save our community. The way to kill off a body is to cut off the head, and then the rest of the body will die. That's why the focus is on the leaders now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Mitchell has so much to say about this issue and knows so much about it from experience. I'm sure we'll be hearing from him again during the question and answer session. Let me just say to our panelists before we bring them on that there is a timekeeper. It's this beautiful sister right here in front, and she's been instructed to enforce this. So let us try to keep it within the 5 minutes of presentation time, and we can move right along so that we can give our audience an opportunity to participate. Before we get into the panel, I'd like to say that we will have copies of the New Orleans Tribune. They did a special issue on harassment, black leadership under attack. And next to Dr. Sawyer's documents, it's one of the most comprehensive articles that's been done. So before you leave, you'll want to get a copy of these, but they will be handed out after the session in the back. I'd also like to recognize the elected officials who are with us today. Would you please stand? Let's give them a big hand. I wish we had time to recognize all of you and to have each of you speak. We'd like to make certain that we invite all of you back this afternoon at the strategy session at 1 o'clock, which will change from this room to the map room on the terrace level. And now I have the wonderful opportunity to bring to you a woman's woman, our own Queen Mother, the person to whom at one time in all of our careers we all go to for counsel and for the sharing of her great wisdom. This world would be even more difficult for us were it not for the strong and continuing leadership of my sister, Dr. Dorothy Height, President of the National Council of Negro Women. Dr. Height, would you come now? She will serve as moderator for the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know that we all want to say thanks to Congressman Dimely and Faye Williams and to all of the sponsors for this opportunity, because we all get bits and pieces of information, but it's good for us all to get together to share what each other sees, but also get a sense of our common destiny, of our common concern. And as Faye Williams has said, we will start this morning with a hearing, and then this afternoon we'll have the strategy session. Just want to tell you that one of the benefits that we have from the long struggle for civil rights was the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And out of the Texas primaries, out of the Voting Rights Act, one of the things of which we can be proud is the fact that we have today the large number of black elected officials and appointed officials. And in a sense, it is ironic that we are here recognizing that even though we have some almost 7,000 strong, we still have so small a percentage of all elected officials. And yet we are here talking about what is happening with those we have. And I think that this is something in which I was glad to hear the congressman say he would hope that all of our organizations would take the information seriously and we would use the strategy session this afternoon to see how we move. Some of you came in since the time that Congressman Dimely told us that we are to be adjourned promptly at 11 o'clock because he wants us to come to the Capitol because there will be a press conference there letting it be known that we do not want to see Graham-Rudman enforced. And we have so much to lose if that happens. And I think all of us have learned that once these steps are taken, they seem to be irreversible. So they remain. It is not that they were there for a few days and it returns. We learned that through the Reagan years, and we're still trying to recover at so many elements in our lives. So that a part of what I'm going to use is to help us use the time as effectively as we can. I'd like all of our panelists to come forward. I think Bishop Stallings has come in. I don't see Unita Blackwell, but as they come, we'll ask them to come forward. And in order to facilitate, I want to tell us how we're going to operate. Each person has been asked to speak for 5 minutes. We have a beautiful timekeeper. I'll ask our sister here to stand, our timekeeper, so that we will see. She is our timekeeper. Now, I'm giving her, in the presence of witnesses, this instruction. At the end of 5 minutes, she is to stand. And that's a warning to the speaker. Then she is to be seated. At the end of 6 minutes, she is to stand if they have not been seated. And she will remain standing until they sit down. And if it seems to be too tough, you have to applaud and help her. So we're all in this together. And I think that what we really want to say, and I want to use a hearing format, I'm going to call for 2 or 3 people with the hope that each will follow the other quickly. And as you do in a hearing, you always identify yourself again in case someone doesn't remember it. I want to give one general introduction to everyone to say, all of the people we will hear from today are people right there on the firing lines. They are people duly elected or duly appointed. They are highly qualified, and they are African Americans of whom all of us can be proud. And we want to start and ask one who pioneered in Alabama if he will start us off, the great mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, the Honorable Richard Arrington. And following him will be one of those Wilmington, you remember there was a Wilmington group once? I think we often forget our history, but he is now serving as Executive Director of the United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice, the Reverend Benjamin Chavis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Before my time starts, let me just point out that I have copies of a report here, certainly, which those who have a real interest in what has happened and would like to get an overview of what has happened in Alabama on this issue, I would suggest you pick up one of those copies before you leave. There is appended to that report a pretty good and comprehensive report of the prosecutions of officials in Alabama and the 25% conviction rate in Alabama. So I would invite you to get a copy of that if you're quite interested. It is going to, I'm going to try to give a summary here. I have prepared my report in a summary manner. I'm Richard Arrington, Jr., Mayor of the City of Birmingham, Alabama. I have been Mayor of Birmingham since November 1979. Prior to becoming mayor, I was a member of the 9-member Birmingham City Council from 1971 to 79. All total, I have served about 19 years as an elected official in the city of Birmingham. I was the second African American elected to the Birmingham City Council, the first to serve as the city's mayor. The city of Birmingham has a mayor-council form of government in which the mayor is the chief executive, and hence it is considered a strong mayor form of government. The investigations that I talk about began with COINTELPRO. I first became a target of a federal investigation in 1972 under the FBI's infamous COINTELPRO operations. That's a well-documented racial counterintelligence program which selectively targeted without cause vocal black civil rights activists. 23 FBI field officers participated in that operation against black nationalists. Included in the activities were the felonious harassment of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and other civil rights activists, the development of a target list of some 18,000 African-American activists during the 1960s and 70s, the mailing of obscene material, racially motivated materials, and things of that sort. I can only tell you that to date, I do not know why I was a target of that investigation. I was linked with the Alabama Black Liberation Front, the Black Panthers Party, and the Concerned Citizens for Justice. I have never been a member of any one of those groups. I can only conclude that I was investigated because I was undoubtedly the most vocal spokesman against police brutality in Birmingham, Alabama, and police brutality was very, very rampant at that time. From my investigations into this matter, I am totally convinced that black elected officials who constitute less than 2% of the nation's elected officials are being disproportionately targeted for investigation by organizations in federal government carrying out public corruption probes. I believe that the statement of David Runkle, who is a spokesman for the U.S. Attorney Richard Thornburg, reflects the bias that there is in these public corruption investigations of blacks. Runkle said this, and I quote, when he was asked about these investigations against black elected officials, he said, and I quote, the only targets of these investigations are those doing wrong, end of quote. Now, when in the Justice Department, we abandon the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and instead move from a presumption of guilt and go out and look for the evidence to prove the position you've already taken, we're in serious trouble. And that was the position taken by Mr. Runkle, who is Mr. Thornburg's spokesman. In Alabama, we have responded to the harassment, and I suppose the best thing for me to do is just to give you a quick idea of what we have done. We have done a number of reports. We have filed a number of complaints with federal agencies. We've asked for investigations by the Senate Judiciary Committee. There are 3 or 4 comprehensive reports on what goes on in Alabama that we have distributed. And we continue to fight. We have hired legal assistance just to deal with the issue of investigations of black elected officials. Let me give you a summary of the investigations on the Birmingham mayor, on me. In 1985, a preliminary investigation was started. And this is after I became mayor and I was no longer a city council member. The FBI conducted a preliminary investigation to determine if the Hobbs Act had been committed, violations had been committed. It covered just about every aspect of my business, financial, and political dealings. Included was an investigation of a marketing corporation, partly owned by me, investigation of a funeral home that my wife and I had a partial ownership in, the purchase of a city-owned building by a business partner of mine, the appointment of an architect for a city project. All of these were included in the investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Birmingham concluded that the preliminary inquiry gave no reason to believe that a federal crime was committed and noted that sufficient probable cause did not exist to proceed with the investigation. No further inquiry into this matter was being made according to FBI records on the investigation. During the investigation period, a bug and device was found on several of the phones in my office, but the FBI said that matter was closed. In 86-88, the FBI started other investigations. Following the publicity of the 85 FBI investigations, the FBI initiated investigations on complaints of unidentified sources that alleged that there was corruption in City Hall. This was an undercover FBI operation that was code-named Bowtie. That was my code name in the FBI files. 2 Atlanta FBI agents worked with the Birmingham agents. They tried sting operations on city land purchase. They used, from 86 through 88, November 88, they used electronic devices, video monitoring, concealed body microphones, audio tapes, 35mm photographs, visual surveillance of the mayor by the agents. They followed me from place to place. They took down the tag numbers of all cars that were at places I attended. And I could go on and on, time doesn't lie. But following these extensive investigations of 2 years, which involved at least 4 other FBI out-of-state offices, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, reported a lack of evidence from its undercover operation to substantiate allegations of wrongdoings by the mayor. They said on October 4th, 1988, that the file on that investigation is closed. Well, let me say this, and I'll just have to take my seat to stay within the time frame. At some point during 1988, federal agents in Alabama met and developed a hit list. And the investigations continued through 88 into 1990. And we in Alabama have done a rather detailed study and hired investigators, and so we have perhaps one of the most comprehensive studies about those activities of any you'll find any place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There is much more to that story. Because the members are still in session, I promised them as they came in we would recognize them. At this time, I'd like to recognize Congressman Floyd Flake from New York. Just a few moments ago, we had with us Congressman Kwesi Mfume from Maryland, and of course, Congressman Dimely, for those of you who've just arrived. All right, we're ready to go, Ben. While Ben is coming up, let me just ask if the representative from Attorney General Thornburg's office is here. We had a very popular session. We had requests to attend from everybody, and I just want to know if they made it. Thank you. I assume he'll identify himself if he comes in. I'm sorry, Congressman William Clay is here. Do you have anything else you want to say about him? No. Okay. Thank you very much.
Good morning. On behalf of the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, we are very pleased to participate in this panel. And I will follow the instructions of my dear moderator very carefully. Being a preacher, I get warmed up in 5 minutes. But let me just go straight to the point. I'm not an elected official, but I have something to do with elected officials. I've worked all of my adult life and part of my childhood for voting rights, for civil rights, and for human rights, for the purpose so that we could have some sisters and brothers in place to represent us. And so when African American elected and appointed officials are harassed, I'm harassed. The motivation for this harassment is racial, it's political, and it's economic. But it is mainly racial. There's a double standard when it comes to who gets investigated, how they're investigated, how they're portrayed in the media. And I'm here, I guess, on behalf of the African American community to say that we are not going to stand by and allow our African American elected and appointed officials to be harassed. Because when they are harassed, we are harassed. Now, that was an interesting quote that Mayor Arrington read from the Justice Department. The Justice Department ladies, they only investigate those who do wrong. Well, it seems to me that in the eyes of the Justice Department, and I want to just talk about in the eyes of the Bush administration, in the eyes of the Reagan administration, the only thing wrong done was getting elected in the first place. And see, and this raises some serious questions about what kind of democracy we have in the United States of America. It is an absolute insult. It is an absolute affront to every sense of democracy for our African American elected and appointed officials to be harassed by government agencies, by federal and state agencies, for no other purpose than to remove them from office. This has a definite effect on our community. We talk about having the need to have role models for our youth to aspire, and we have many. But what do you think is in the mind of our young people when they see our elected officials dogged and harassed and assassinated, have their characters assassinated in the media? Most of these officials have already been tried and convicted in the media. And so there's a complicity between those who investigate and those who report and how it's done. And so we are hopeful that the Center for the Study of African American Officials gets established. But I want to say that those of us in the community, we need to support that center with our financial resources and our energies. And from the church community that's represented here and the community organizations, we have to make this at the top of our agenda. There's an aggression. You know, Bush insults me all the time. He makes these eloquent speeches about the United States going to great lengths to stop aggression in the Persian Gulf. Well, I want aggression to be stopped in Birmingham, Alabama. I want aggression to be stopped in Selma, Alabama. I want aggression to be stopped in Louisiana and across not only the southern parts of these states, but like Malcolm said, the South is anything south of the Canadian border. It's the whole country. It's the whole United States. And this is very, very serious, sisters and brothers. I think one of the most serious panels that the Congressional Black Caucus is having this weekend is this panel, because it raises serious questions about our presence in a society that treats us unfairly, that treats us unjustly, that punishes us when we try to make the democracy work. And so we aren't going to let Mayor Arrington stand alone. We aren't going to let Representative Davis stand alone. We aren't going to let all of the officials that are being harassed stand alone. We're going to make this system operate right, or it's not going to operate at all. God bless you.
We've heard from a mayor. Now we will hear from a member of the Congress of the United States, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Honorable William Clay, Democrat from Missouri.
Thank you, and let me say thanks to Merv Damley and the members of this Brain Trust for sponsoring this seminar and for permitting me to present my views on a very important matter concerning our system of criminal injustice. If anyone in this Congress, indeed anyone in this society, is qualified to, from personal experiences, to address the question of prosecutorial abuses, it has to be a person like myself who's been subjected by agents of government to every ingenious, illegal scheme possible to devise. If anyone can speak to this subject from the perspective of an innocent victim, hounded by the doggish tactics of unscrupulous prosecutors, I'm that person. From 1972 until 1977, my life was a nightmare of legal entanglements, requiring me to respond to absurd media accusations and unreasonable federal investigations. During this 5-year inquisition, I was a target of 3 federal grand jury investigations, 3 FBI probes, an IRS inquiry for criminal tax evasion, and the tapping of my telephones at the office and my home by the Drug Enforcement Agency. During my 1974 campaign for re-election, I was even investigated for importing a hitman from California to kill my opponent. That charge takes the cake. But it was a serious investigation. Now, I'm considered in St. Louis, by friend and foe alike, as the smartest, most adept elected official in the whole state of Missouri. And if that's true, and I contend it is, why would I go all the way to California to import a hitman when so many in my district were unemployed? And at the press conference, after 2 weeks or so of this being front page news in every newspaper in the country, you see, I was being challenged at that time by a member of the St. Louis Board of Police Commissioners. And a member of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen had said that she overheard a conversation in a cocktail lounge between 2 fellows from California, indicating that I had imported them to kill the police commissioner. But after 2 weeks of all of this being on national television, et cetera, I decided to call a press conference at the St. Louis airport, got on the plane, flew into St. Louis, held a press conference giving them the background and history of myself, my struggle to get to where I was. And I ended it by saying, since this story surfaced, at least 3 hitmen in this district have volunteered to kill that nigger for free. All right. That ended all of the stories. Now, although we can sometimes find levity in many situations, what happened to me and what's happening to other black elected officials today is really no laughing matter. The harassment, humiliation, the intimidation I suffered in the campaign of official lawlessness included all of the tactics employed in the police state. Certain elements of the media, the business community, and the Justice Department engaged in concerted effort to deny my re-election by publicly ridiculing and embarrassing me, but most of all, they schemed to send me to the penitentiary. I became the victim of biased reporting, printing of false accusation, and obscene coverage by the white communications media, harassment of family members, friends, and political associates by the Internal Revenue Service, the FBI, the DEA, and the U.S. Attorney, the release of false information by government agents and illegal surveillance by local and federal police, illegal wiretapping of my telephones, tax audits by the Internal Revenue for criminal violations, a suit by the Justice Department demanding that I pay $89,000 for allegedly filing false travel records, grand jury investigations for payroll padding, FBI inquiry for unreported campaign contributions, and 2 attempts in 10 years by the state legislature to gerrymander the district I represent by dividing black voters into 3 separate districts. In one election, they also purged the registration rolls in my district of 20,000 black voters 3 days before a hotly contested election with a white candidate. I went to court, a court injunction, kept the rolls open until midnight, 5 hours past the normal closing time, so that all of the persons illegally purged could cast their votes, and I won handily. Apologists for such abuses argued that since no evidence of wrongdoing was uncovered, why are we raising all of this hell? And that's precisely the point. If no grounds existed to give probable cause of wrongdoing, why should we have to spend thousands of dollars to defend ourselves against non-crimes invented by corrupt public officials and degenerate media personalities? Now, the scenario used against me in the 70s, Mr. Nixon, too, my friend, was no friend of anybody that was decent. The scenario used against me in the 70s is the same as that now used against other black leaders today. It hasn't changed much. Initially, there were a series of charges by the media into my political and personal life, the same as today. So-called investigative reporters wrote outlandish articles quoting unnamed sources and undocumented data purporting to be factual exposés of criminal activities. And these highly questionable, irresponsible attacks became the basis for official government investigations of criminal acts. I see my time has run out, and you can't ask for unanimous consent to proceed for another 5 minutes here, so thank you.
Congressman Dimely told us earlier about the work of an African-American sister who really went out to get the information, who gave up a job in order to document what was happening. And I'm pleased to present Dr. Mary Sawyer, the author of The Dilemma of Black Politics and the Harassment of Black Elected Officials 10 years later.
Thank you, Mrs. Height. I'm indeed honored to be included in the family. I want to say also that Congressman Dimely was most kind in his opening remarks regarding my role in addressing this issue. I can assure you that no one has been more faithful in addressing this matter than has he. I was pleased, too, that he acknowledged the role of George Brown, a former Lieutenant Governor of Colorado, in addressing this issue. It was actually Governor Brown who first brought the matter to my attention and to the attention of the National Association of Human Rights Workers 15 years ago. We are all indebted to Governor Brown, and I would like us to acknowledge his presence here with us today. When I wrote the initial report on harassment of black elected officials in 1977, I concluded the litany of politicians who had been attacked with a quote from Lorraine Hansberry. "I am the first to say that ours is a complex and difficult country," she wrote, "and some of our complexities are indeed grotesque. We who are black Americans can offer that last remark with unwavering insistence. It is, on the other hand, also a great nation with certain beautiful and indestructible traditions and potentials which can be seized by all of us who possess imagination and love of humanity. There is a great deal to be fought in America, but at the same time, There is so much which begs to be but reaffirmed and cherished with sweet defiance. What is to be reaffirmed and cherished, I was trying to suggest, is the collectivity of progressive-minded, committed public servants who endure even in the face of torturous scrutiny and unconscionable malignment. That was not to say that these officials were the embodiment of perfection. I have a dear and wise friend who got married a few years ago and whose choice of a best man was quite startling to me. I expressed my surprise to my friend, and in characteristic fashion, he said to me, "Well, it is the case that the best man isn't perfect. He's just the best man." It is important to be able to assert both our integrity and our imperfections. They are not mutually exclusive. Certainly, all officials should be held accountable. That is a given. But black elected officials should not be required to be perfect. Neither should black officials be held to a double standard of performance, either personally or professionally. But I do not at this time want to reiterate the contents of my two reports. What I want to speak to today is the matter of whether harassment of black officials is just about race. This is a question which is posed to me time and time again. Every time a new case arises, reporters ask me if race is the sole motive for harassment. When predominantly black juries acquit black officials, commentators attribute their decisions solely to race. When local communities organize to support officials who are under attack, the motive is presumed to be strictly racial identification. My response to the question is that obviously race is involved, but no, harassment is not just about the racial classification of the official. What it is about is all the social and cultural precipitates of this nation's history of racial discrimination. We tend as a nation to be ahistorical, to discount the significance of yesterday. Consequently, we deny the legacy of what happened 25 or 50 or 200 years ago. I am by no means suggesting that racial prejudice is not a reality in our society today, only that the harassment and the response to it are not fully accounted for solely in those terms. The issue is far more complex than that, and I would suggest that until white America becomes willing and able to examine those complexities, the harassment will continue. Harassment of black officials in large part is about vested economic interests. It is about the threat posed to existing power configurations when people get jobs who never got jobs before, when people get contracts who never got contracts before, when people get services who never got services before. Harassment of black officials is also about style, about how they present themselves in the world as African Americans, which is to say, as other than conservative establishment Euro-Americans. It is about cultural differences and perceptual differences, and so it is about being strangers to one another. Harassment of black officials is also about spiritual values, and perhaps most especially about spiritual values. The support that was expressed for Marion Barry and for Adam Clayton Powell and Coleman Young and Richard Arrington, which the establishment finds so mystifying and which it therefore dismisses as ignorance on the part of the people, this support is a statement of orientation to the world. That is to say, it is a reflection of people's understanding of how life works and why things happen as they do. And these are fundamentally religious matters. Religion is concerned with life and death, with good and evil, with righteous power and demonic power, with suffering and retribution and forgiveness, with corporate morality as well as individual morality. Black religion has always been concerned especially with justice and freedom, and even in a city plagued with drugs and violence, the black religious ethos is not denied. Around the country now, I find growing movements of resistance, increasing mobilizations of support, and evolving consciousness of the significance of harassment and of the need to take personal responsibility for fighting back. I am encouraged by these signs, and I am moved to say anew, there is indeed a great deal to be fought in America, but at the same time, there is so much which begs to be but reaffirmed and cherished with sweet defiance.
And sisters come in all colors. Recognizing the real role of the church and religion, it's a pleasure to present the Most Reverend George Stallings, Jr., Bishop and founder of the African American Catholic Congregations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haidt. To all who have gathered here today, I could not have been asked to make my comments than after Dr. Sawyer, who has really placed within the proper context what the African American Catholic congregation is all about, that we believe that a people who do not take control of their destiny, moved by the genius of their culture, can never achieve full spiritual, economic, political, cultural, and psychological maturity. So what we're talking about here today involves all of those issues that Dr. Sawyer has enunciated so well and has really laid the groundwork for my presentation. My question is, what have we come to in America? What have we come to in America, in the land of the free and the home of the brave? What have we come to in America when we look at black elected and appointed officials and try to bring them down in an attempt to not cope with a system that is out of sync with a Eurocentric value system? And that too many of our black elected and appointed officials have been judged by a Eurocentric value system that has really been rooted in what I would call European cultural hegemony, or white world dominance, or white world supremacy. That what we have sought to do is to somehow judge black elected as well as appointed officials by a standard that doesn't even begin to measure up to the effectiveness that black officials have shown in their particular areas of jurisdiction. What we have to really be concerned about is that we are talking about harassing people, a race of people who have been denied, locked out, and locked up. That what we are dealing with is the inability of a nation to cope with a new style of political leadership that is not only effective in black communities, but also effective in predominantly non-black communities. That we would not be looking at a Mayor Norman Rice in a northwestern city if he did not have the credentials to lead a people. And therefore, when we look at black elected and appointed officials, we have to ask ourselves, what is wrong when a disproportionate number of black elected and appointed officials are being harassed by the government? Not denying that black officials can do wrong. We're not, to say that we are talking about the harassment of black elected and appointed officials today is not to say that blacks can do no wrong. No one has ever said that. But what we are saying very clearly is that the percentage of black elected and appointed officials is disproportionate to the numbers elected and appointed. And that if you look at the percentages, and it doesn't take a grammar school diploma to figure that out, that when you look at the percentage of elected officials in this country as opposed to the number of blacks, that the number of blacks being harassed is disproportionate. And that when they are harassed, the government often is overreaching and overzealous. As you look in the case of Marion Barry, with which I was very much associated, it is obvious that the government overreached, that it was overzealous. It is obvious that the government investigated Marion for a number of years, just as they've done William Clay and Adam Clayton Powell, Clarence Mitchell III, Floyd Flake, just as they've done Richard Arrington. It's obvious that they have spent millions of dollars in an attempt over a decade or more to entrap these officials. And yet at the same time, they never come up with anything of substance, and yet they do not desist. They do not cease and desist in their attempt. They keep trying until they can bring one down. And what we need to ask ourselves as a people is, are we going to allow the diversionary tactics of the government to distract our elected and appointed officials from doing their job? They cannot effectively do their job if they're constantly being harassed, if they're constantly being investigated. And when they cannot come up with the evidence, why don't they leave them alone? That's the point. And so therefore, we have to stand up. we as a people, we as the public must stand up and challenge the government in presenting its evidence or leaving our officials alone. If not you, who? And if not now, when? All right.
We turn now to a state representative, one who has worked at that level, the Representative Patricia Davis, former state representative from Alabama.
Good morning. I'd like to say thank you very much, Ms. Heights. I'd like to thank Congressman Donnelly for his long, hard work, Senator Clarence Mitchell in this struggle. I'd like to let you know a little bit about Pat Davis. I'm Pat Davis. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm by profession, I'm a teacher. I was served in the legislature of the state of Alabama from 1982 to 1989. I served as the National Vice President of the National Caucus of Black State Legislators. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about what has happened to Pat Davis. For most of you sit back as elected officials and you feel that this can't happen to me. But I want you to know, come for me in the morning, come for you this evening. I want you to know a bit about what took place. I represented District 58, which is a part of the city of Birmingham. Want you to know that in July of 1989, I was indicted. I was indicted under 8 counts of, 1 count of conspiracy and 7 counts of bribery. However, when the investigation started, I knew nothing about the investigation. No one had said a word to me. There was 6 carloads of FBI agents sent out to my home. My house was surrounded. All of this is about a bill now. If there's a bill that we're talking about, this force, they call it from my understanding a show of force. I have 3 sons. It frightened my 16-year-old to death. My neighborhood was blocked off and everybody who was coming into my neighborhood was questioned. I had to leave my home for 2 days to get away from the harassment. As a teacher, I taught at a local community college. Every day I went to school, I was followed to school every day. It got to the point where I was telling them that, well, if we're going to go to school every day, I could ride with you and save some gas. Yeah. My friends, after that point, my friends were followed. Everywhere we went, we were followed. Then the worst thing of all happened. I was accused of drugs. And certainly, you know, when this kind of information is distributed in the community, people look at you kind of one-sided or one way. So when we heard about the drug allegation, the first thing we did was to go down and have a drug test. And I went to the doctor and I told him that I wanted to be tested for every drug known to mankind. I was told that there was a test that you could get for your hair and one through the urine sample. I told him I wanted all of them. I did take the test, have a copy of the test, and I tested negative for everything except aspirins. If I had known I was going to test positive for the aspirins, I wouldn't have taken them that day. I've never had a drinking problem. I've never had a drug problem. When I went to the attorney to find out where the allegations came from, we were told, the prosecutor told my attorney that he heard me sniffing on the telephone and heard me tell my son to bring me some Coke. I'm talking about Coca-Cola. This is where the allegations came from. But however, all of this information was carried into a grand jury. And the people that were questioned before this grand jury, each time they were asked, have you seen Pat Davis do drugs? This is what they asked my secretary. Or did you do drugs with Pat Davis? Certainly they all denied it because it was no truth to it. But that still left the implication there with the grand jury that I must have been on some type of drugs. There was a official fundraiser that I had at a local hotel there in Birmingham. And in having this fundraiser there, one of the local mining officials asked me if he could bring his brother-in-law with him. And I says, well, sure, you have no problem. Bring your brother-in-law, because I'm looking at this as another $250 that's going to help me on my campaign re-election. This local person that he was going to bring, this brother-in-law, was the FBI agent. And this FBI agent was at the fundraiser, monitoring everything that was said and everything that was done. So this is the way these people work. You know, the telephone in my office was bugged at my school. The telephone in my office in the Capitol was bugged. The telephone at my home was bugged. I want you to know that I don't know exactly what happened, and one of the officials asked me, he said, well, Pat, what in the world did you do? And I'm still trying to find out what did I do to cause and to warrant this kind of thing happening. But the one thing I do know, it was all about a bill. And the only way that the federal government had any authority was that they used the word interstate commerce. If the bill had come out of committee, and if the bill had passed, then it would have been federal. But the bill never came out of committee. The bill was never passed. So there was no reason the federal government had anything to do with this particular bill. It was a state issue. But they used interstate commerce based on the fact of what would have taken place if the bill had passed. The bill was called Buy Alabama Coal. Coal is one of the greatest natural resources that we have in our state. And we were trying to get more coal miners working in our state because you had a lot of coal miners that were laid off. And certainly, you know, it was the coal miners versus the local utility company there in my city. And based on that, my time is up, based on the fact of that, we just had several problems coming out of the fact that you wanted to keep the coal miners working and the utility companies wanted to buy foreign coal. So that's where the problem began. But to make a long story short, there's a long fight, there's a long struggle. I was convicted. I was convicted on 4 counts. The other 4 counts we were acquitted of. There was 1 black on the jury. Out of the 14, even with the 2 alternates, there was 1 black on the jury. I was convicted of 6.5 years with no parole. However, you know, when these things first happen to you, you lose weight, you cry, you worry, you do all of those things. But then after a while, the Lord says, you have to work. You have to get up and do what it takes, whatever is necessary. So at this point, this is what we're doing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. A good thing is we're going to have some time for questions because our panelists have been so faithful to the time. A congressional race that got national attention was that of Faye Williams when she ran for the Congress in the state of Louisiana, and I'm pleased to call on Faye Williams to share with us now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can talk very fast. The harassment and attempts to discredit black leaders extend far beyond the government harassment. However, it seems that the government has endless agents in our community, even in the African American community and all of the community, which is another tragedy we must address. Although I am not an elected official either, I've been named by my supporters as Congresswoman in exile from Louisiana, and I serve and serve well. I'm simply asked to do these things because my case has been called the classic case of various methods used to prevent the expansion of black leadership. That's something else we have to watch. From about 6 weeks prior to the primary in 1986, I was running well ahead of my opponent by 20 percentage points. So it was obvious that in order to defeat me, there would have to be a negative campaign run against me. Within a few days after I won the primary, which nobody expected me to win, the Alexandria Daily Town Talk, the newspaper that had been most hostile to my campaign, editorialized on a 16-year-old divorce problem I had experienced, and of course I became the villain instead of the abused spouse that I was. And I almost lost my life in that incident because my husband didn't want me to get a divorce, and most guys said, I don't blame him. At the time of the tragedy, I was typing a newspaper release regarding the question that the whole country was asking: is Angela Davis being framed? And of course, the night of the tragedy, this was found in my typewriter, and it came out as my saying, Angela Davis is being framed. Well, of course, if I'm saying Angela Davis is being framed, I live in Los Angeles at the same time as Angela Davis did at that time. All black people know each other, therefore you know Angela Davis, and if you know her, you must be a communist or at least a communist sympathizer. Got the effect they expected. Letters to the editor started coming in, calling me just that. Again, I'm running 20 points ahead of my opponent on the eve of the 1986 general election, and we had to take a helicopter in order to get around to the district, which consists of 300 little towns, and it's a massive district. As we were approaching our last stop, we were met by a full show of military readiness, ordered to land at England Air Force Base. We were surrounded by 30 or 40 guns, armored personnel carriers, you name it. And by the time we got out of there, we were freed. We were just glad to be getting out of there. However, when we got back to the office after having been ordered to do various things, we thought that this had just been a mistake. However, by that time, someone from this secure military base had already called the newspaper office, who called us and relayed the incident to us, and we played it down, not wanting to screw up on the day before the election. We just said, hey, they were just doing their jobs, made no big deal of it. However, we woke up on the morning of the election, and what did the headline read? Williams is rude, abusive, and threatening to the military. They had the guns. I was threatening. I mean, how ironic. And of course, we were held up, as I said, right on past the evening news. Well, the purpose was to keep me from getting at the undecided voters that evening. But then we thought that everything that could happen had already happened when we experienced a computer breakdown. And when the computer came back on, instead of winning, we had lost by 0.7%. Pat tells you about the drug test challenge. That's a biggie. They do it to all of us. They just assume we're all on drugs. I was challenged to one also because I had once worked for the National Football League Players Union, and they were opposed to mandatory drug testing, and if I work for them, I must have the same position, and that also must mean that I am for the support of illegal use of illegal drugs. They have great reasoning. Then there was the National Rifle Association. You know about them. Although I had the same position as George Bush, the police chiefs all across the country, I was accused of wanting to take away all the guns from all the sportsmen of the sportsman paradise of the world. I'm from Louisiana, you see, and you would have thought they needed Uzis and assault guns to kill rabbits. I was targeted, of course, by the conservatives because I was pro-choice. The pro-Israel lobby targeted me because my campaign manager was Arab American. And it was obvious to us when they sent us the telegram questioning the ethnic background of my campaign manager. They did not buy my story, you know, that I just wanted a balanced Middle East policy. As it turned out, we need one even today. But they sent out a news release. Nevertheless, after sending a contribution to my opponent, who was a Republican, they told me that they would rather support a near KKKer than to support me, you know, the old liberal Democrat, which the head of the lobby in Louisiana is said to be a liberal Democrat. But I guess that meant that he supports you only if you are white and or male. In the 1986 election, I received 97,000 votes, and any member of Congress can tell you that's nearly twice as many votes as they received when they won their races, but I still lost. In 1988, despite the national Willie Horton campaign that was run, I received nearly 90,000 votes, twice as many as congressmen before me ever needed in this district. And then in the 1988 primary, I received more votes than all of the Democratic opponents I had combined, and added all up. Neither of them supported me, however, in the general election, which is another form of harassment we have to deal with. They expect our vote all the time, but they forget when we happen to win the primary. In the 1986 race, only one of my Democratic opponents supported me, and that was for a hefty staff salary. But they don't just support us just because we were out there working and the only Democrat in the race. In my 1986 race, my National Democratic Committee member supported me, but not in 1988. In wrapping up, let me just say, even though I came out of the two races with a $100,000 campaign debt, as many of these other people around here have done, with no job, and experienced the deaths in rapid succession of my father, of my sister, my grandmother, my aunt, my cousin, and even my high school sweetheart within just a matter of weeks, I want you to know that I still feel blessed when I hear the frequent horror stories from all across this country of families that are being destroyed. Because in spite of all the efforts to discredit me, my brothers and sisters, all the threats on my life during that campaign, the various dangers which required me to travel with armed guards, and the great burden of still having to carry both the personal and the campaign debts which I experienced at that time, I'm not sorry about challenging a system that's inherently unfair to African Americans, and we must come together and do things about it. It is unfair even when there is no allegation in my